The air in the Palacio Real is thick with lilies and the faint breath of decay. Madrid, September 29, 1833. For you, the attending royal anatomist, the most macabre part of duty begins now. King Ferdinand VII, who ruled Spain through 2 turbulent decades, lies cold upon his bier. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, awaits you with a grave directive, a final, unsettling procedure concerning the late sovereign's remains, your hands steady as you approach the silk-draped catafalque. Even in death, his face holds that familiar, imperious calm. Yet your attention must turn to a different matter, one long confined to sealed reports and cautious whispers, a private medical question that shadowed the monarch's life and marriage, a controversy archivists mention only in guarded terms. What follows is not mere embalming, it is the careful sealing of a symbol. In the hush of this chamber, you are preserving more than a body. You are archiving the residue of a reign shaped by secrecy, excess, and fear. Courtiers once spoke, in veiled language, of special accommodations, of marriages strained by unspoken difficulties, of desperate efforts to secure a stable succession. Tonight, those rumors fall silent beneath the weight of ritual and record. As you begin the final preservation rites, one truth becomes inescapable. Whatever was private in life now becomes history's problem to interpret. You are not only tending to a king, you are closing the book on an age whose power and paranoia left marks on everyone it touched. Before we delve into the darker chapters of his private legacy, if the hidden truths of history and the mechanics of power intrigue you, take a moment to strike the like button and subscribe to Dark Page of History. Tell me where your curiosity finds you tonight in the comments below. It's remarkable that we are bridging centuries and continents through these forgotten stories. To understand the tragedy of King Ferdinand VII, one must first confront the reality of his lineage. His fate was not shaped by myth or divine curse, but by the slow, self-inflicted decay of royal bloodlines. For generations, Europe's dynasties, particularly the houses of Bourbon and Habsburg, pursued marriages within their own circles, believing that purity of blood would preserve power. Instead, it created a legacy of frailty, instability, and rumor. Ferdinand was born at El Escorial in October 1784, the child of Charles IV and Maria Luisa of Parma, who were themselves first cousins. He became the living embodiment of a dynasty collapsing under its own weight, a symbol of a system that prized lineage over logic. As the boy grew, palace physicians noted troubling health issues that were whispered about but never openly discussed. By his adolescence, murmurs of an unspecified royal affliction began to circulate through the court, a condition described vaguely in coded medical reports and private correspondence. These accounts spoke not of scandalous details, but of a young prince burdened by a rare physical deformity that caused deep personal shame and intense secrecy within the palace walls. In these surviving records, written in the restrained tone of 18th-century medicine, the physicians described Ferdinand's case as an unusual, congenital irregularity that may affect conjugal harmony and personal well-being. For historians, the specifics matter less than the pattern it reveals. How private suffering in absolute monarchies often grew into public tragedy. The psychological impact on the young prince was devastating. In an age that equated noble elegance with restraint and proportion, Ferdinand's peculiar condition marked him as an object of whispered fascination, a secret that isolated him long before he wore the crown. What others might have mistaken for privilege became for him a lifelong prison of shame and resentment. Ferdinand's youth was an education in betrayal, a brutal apprenticeship in dysfunction that shaped the tyrant he would later become. Humiliation did not break him, it hardened him. It taught him that control was the only cure for weakness, and cruelty the only language power understood. His upbringing was steeped in parental collapse. His father, Charles IV, was a monarch more devoted to the hunt than to the art of rule. His mother, Maria Luisa of Parma, openly favored her confidant and minister Manuel de Godoy, whose influence over the crown eclipsed that of the king himself. From his earliest years, Ferdinand witnessed the corrosion of authority from within. He learned that affection could be weaponized, loyalty could be bought, and that even blood ties were fragile when power was at stake. Yet, behind the scenes, the palace's most poisonous intrigue revolved around Ferdinand himself, the young heir whose private affliction became the court's most dangerous secret. The royal court became a hive of whispers and veiled laughter. Servants smirked behind closed doors, courtiers traded coded jokes, and foreign envoys quietly recorded every rumor about the troubled heir to the Spanish throne. This constant undercurrent of ridicule did not humble Ferdinand, it hardened him. The humiliation he endured fermented into a deep, corrosive bitterness that would one day shape the way he ruled an entire nation. His growing distrust was not born from delusion alone. People were speaking about him, though not always for the reasons he believed. The young prince began to see mockery everywhere, in polite bows, in hushed conversations, even in the silence of his own chambers. As he entered adulthood, Ferdinand's personality twisted into something darker. His need for control became an obsession, and secrecy turned into his only defense. The prince learned quickly that royal power could be used as a weapon, not to protect, but to punish. Contemporary court accounts paint a portrait of a young man already consumed by paranoia and cruelty. When a palace attendant once breached the strict etiquette of privacy, Ferdinand's reaction was merciless. He used the full weight of royal authority to make an example of the offender, ensuring that no one in the palace would ever dare to cross him again. The lesson was clear. Within Ferdinand's world, humiliation was not to be suffered, it was to be avenged. When Ferdinand reached the age of marriage, the full extent of his private affliction could no longer be hidden. Dr. Francisco Flores, the royal physician, compiled a confidential dossier, a chilling account that revealed what palace whispers had long feared. The future king suffered from a profound anatomical abnormality that defied the understanding of contemporary medicine. The condition was described in cautious, coded language. Flores noted that it was a deviation from natural symmetry so pronounced that normal conjugal life might prove hazardous without intervention. Behind closed doors, physicians and engineers were summoned to devise medical contraptions that could assist the prince in fulfilling his dynastic duty. Their discreet inventions, euphemistically referred to as marital instruments, were intended not for pleasure but for preservation, of reputation, of lineage, and of royal illusion. Yet the physical struggle was only half the tragedy. The psychological toll was devastating. Haunted by rumors, Ferdinand's obsession with finding a cure consumed him. He bankrupted entire treasuries chasing fraudulent remedies sold by alchemists and traveling quacks. He swallowed every promised miracle, secret elixirs of rare minerals, exotic powders and mystical herbs, each claiming to restore balance to what nature had twisted. None worked. But desperation made the king easy prey for every charlatan who entered Madrid's golden gates. The stage for tragedy was now set. In 1802, the crown arranged Ferdinand's first dynastic marriage, a union of convenience with his cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. Maria Antonia, still scarcely more than a girl, arrived in Madrid brimming with the naive optimism of her age. She had heard her fiancé called the Desired One by loyalists and imagined a romantic hero who would restore Spain's honor. The wedding itself was a masterpiece of royal theater, music echoing through cathedral vaults, the streets overflowing with cheers, and the couple presented as the perfect embodiment of Bourbon continuity. But behind the fanfare, a darker reality awaited. Within the palace, quiet preparations hinted that something was not as it seemed. Ferdinand's attendants made discreet, unexplained requests, items of medical assistance rather than celebration. Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting, puzzled by these orders, were assured that such arrangements were customary for royal couples. The young princess's education had been thorough in etiquette and languages, yet silent on the subject of marriage itself. What followed that night remains obscured by history, preserved only in veiled letters written years later by those who served close to the royal chambers. They speak not of scandal, but of sorrow, of a union that began not in romance but in confusion and fear. That single night marked the beginning of a downward spiral, one that would shape both Ferdinand's psyche and Spain's fate for decades to come.
When the royal chamber doors finally closed, what followed was not the blissful beginning of a marriage, but a moment of unimaginable horror. One eyewitness later wrote, "Her Majesty screamed as if she had seen the devil himself." Those who stood outside the door heard cries that sent ripples of dread through the palace corridors. Whatever the young queen expected of matrimony, reality arrived like a nightmare. Her reaction, hysteria, shock, disbelief, became the unspoken scandal of Madrid. Servants whispered that she had been confronted by a truth too grotesque for the delicate mind of a royal bride. Physicians were rushed to the scene under the veil of secrecy. They spoke in coded language, offering medical explanations for what had transpired and attempting to calm the trembling queen. Behind the curtain, all attempts to normalize the situation failed. The night ended not in celebration, but in silence. The kind of silence that follows when something sacred has been irreparably broken. From that night onward, their union became a formality, a public facade masking private despair. Maria Antonia withdrew into sickness and melancholy, while Ferdinand's obsession with control only deepened. The marriage that was meant to secure Spain's future instead planted the seeds of its decay. The trauma left scars neither crown nor ceremony could conceal. Ferdinand's festering paranoia deepened, as his wife's visible revulsion stripped away what little humanity he possessed. Maria Antonia, meanwhile, withdrew into a state of fragile despair, what modern observers might call the psychological collapse born of relentless fear and humiliation. What was meant to be the duty of marriage decayed into a mechanical ritual of dread. Every attempt to produce an heir became a formal performance, stripped of tenderness and hope. The attendants would prepare the royal chamber with methodical precision, while both husband and wife moved through the motions like actors trapped in a cursed play. When it ended, silence reigned, the kind that comes not from peace, but from resignation. As the years dragged on and the cradle remained empty, Ferdinand's desperation mutated into cruelty. He came to believe that his wife's coldness was not emotional but conspiratorial, that her refusal to conceive was an act of defiance. From that suspicion grew an obsession with dominance and control that would define the rest of his reign. Court records from the early 1800s reveal chilling details about Ferdinand's attempts to control every aspect of his doomed marriage. Documents describe the commissioning of special bindings of leather and silk, crafted by the same royal artisans who built the king's ceremonial saddles. Their intended purpose remains shrouded in euphemism, devices of discipline, according to the archives. But their very existence casts a shadow of cruelty and control over the royal household. Ferdinand's obsession soon drifted beyond medicine and into mysticism. He became convinced that the heavens themselves held the key to his dynasty's salvation. Astrologers, alchemists, and mystics were summoned to the palace to chart the stars and restore harmony to the royal union. In candlelit halls, under tapestries depicting saints and angels, strange ceremonies unfolded. Mixtures of superstition and desperation disguised as faith. During one particularly bizarre period, the king fell under the influence of a traveling mystic who promised that divine energy, not science, could heal his affliction. The palace filled with the scent of burning incense and the echo of foreign chants, as Ferdinand clung to the hope that the cosmos might succeed where medicine had failed. Miraculously, Maria Antonia conceived twice. The court erupted in joy. Bells rang through Madrid, and for a fleeting moment, the long-cursed union seemed redeemed. But fate, as always, had other plans. Both of Maria Antonia's pregnancies ended in heartbreak. The first, in 1804, ended abruptly during the 4th month. Official records cited unusual strain upon Her Majesty's delicate constitution, but those close to the court whispered of far more tragic causes, the toll of relentless pressure, fear, and exhaustion. The second pregnancy, a year later, was even more devastating. After months of fragile hope, a prolonged medical crisis claimed the life of the child and nearly that of the Queen herself. Maria Antonia never recovered her strength. Her health and spirit faded, and she became a quiet, ghost-like presence within the palace walls. the shadow of the bright young woman who had once arrived from Naples full of life. Ferdinand's reactions stripped away any illusion of compassion. Instead of mourning, he turned suspicion into cruelty. He became convinced that his wife's frailty was deliberate, that she sought to defy him, to deny him an heir. In his growing paranoia, he accused her of conspiracy, of secret disobedience, even of harboring dangerous modern ideas that threatened his rule. What had begun as a royal union now stood as a grim reflection of Spain itself, a kingdom bound by fear, superstition, and the destructive will of one man's wounded pride. The palace had become a cage of whispers. Ferdinand's poisonous accusations seeped through every corridor, destroying what remained of Maria Antonia's spirit. Haunted by her husband's cruelty, the young queen began to believe that she was truly cursed, that heaven itself had turned its face from her. Her final months were marked by endless prayer and self-blame, seeking forgiveness for sins she had never committed. When Maria Antonia died in May 1806, barely 21 years old, the official announcement cited fever and exhaustion. But to those who had served her, that explanation rang hollow. They saw a woman consumed by despair, slowly undone by years of fear, isolation, and unrelenting emotional torment. Even in death, Maria Antonia could not escape Ferdinand's shadow. Whispers spread through the palace that her passing had not been natural. Some claim she had been poisoned, not by political rivals, but by the very man who once called her his queen. The suspicions deepened when the royal apothecary was found dead only days later. Among his effects was said to be a letter, seized at once by Ferdinand's guards and never seen again. What truth that letter contained remains one of history's enduring mysteries. Was it a record of hidden poisons, or a confession of the unspeakable cruelty that haunted Spain's royal chambers? In public, Ferdinand wore the mask of grief. He attended ceremonies, issued proclamations of mourning, and allowed portraits to depict him as the sorrowful widower. But behind palace doors, his demeanor told another story. Within weeks of Maria Antonia's death, the king began discreetly inquiring about potential brides, women known not for beauty or virtue, but for one quality alone: proven fertility. Meanwhile, the royal physicians worked in secret, desperately seeking ways to prevent further scandal. Their efforts produced some of the most eccentric medical experiments in Bourbon history: strange devices, whispered theories, and procedures shrouded in euphemism, all intended to ease the royal burden. None succeeded. Each attempt only deepened the legend of a monarch at war with his own nature. By the time Ferdinand remarried, the damage was irreversible. The mixture of humiliation, paranoia, and unrelenting pride had twisted him beyond redemption. What began as insecurity had become pathology, a cold conviction that other people existed only to serve his will. Ferdinand no longer saw his subjects, his advisors, or even his family as human beings. They were instruments to be used, obstacles to be crushed, or shadows to be ignored. His reign, from that point forward, would bear the unmistakable mark of a man consumed not by grief, but by obsession. Ferdinand's dealings with the palace staff grew darker with each passing month. What began as temper and paranoia evolved into calculated cruelty. He began testing the limits of his authority, issuing arbitrary commands designed less to govern and more to terrify. Servants who displeased him simply vanished from sight. Guards who failed to uphold the silence surrounding the royal chambers were reassigned to the farthest, most perilous frontiers of Spain's fading empire. This climate of fear fed his obsession with ridicule. Though whispers about his private afflictions had long circulated, Ferdinand's reactions were wildly excessive. He became convinced that mockery followed him everywhere, in the halls, in the shadows, in polite laughter that lingered too long. He began keeping secret ledgers, lists of mockers, as he called them, names of courtiers, soldiers, even priests, each marked for future retribution. By 1807, Ferdinand stood at the center of a movement that would shake Spain to its core. A coalition of generals and nobles, calling themselves the Fernandinos, sought to overthrow the corrupt rule of Charles IV and his powerful minister Godoy. They saw in Ferdinand a savior, a symbol of renewal, patriotism and reform. But what they could not see was the truth. Behind the facade of El Deseado, the desired one, stood a man already consumed by paranoia and cruelty, a ruler whose inner demons would soon devour the very kingdom he was destined to save.
What the Fernandinos, the ambitious nobles and generals rallying behind the prince, chose to ignore was the growing evidence of Ferdinand's instability and his increasingly ruthless treatment of anyone who questioned him. They mistook cruelty for strength and paranoia for political cunning, blind to the darkness already consuming the man they hailed as Spain's salvation. This dangerous game reached its peak in October 1807 with the infamous El Escorial conspiracy. Ferdinand was exposed in a plot to overthrow his own father, aided by envoys secretly connected to Napoleon Bonaparte. When the scheme unraveled, Ferdinand revealed his truest nature, not the courage of a revolutionary, but the cowardice of a survivor. Rather than protect the men who had risked everything for him, he betrayed them all. He confessed in detail, naming names, handing over letters, and begging for his parents' forgiveness. His allies were imprisoned or exiled. Ferdinand, meanwhile, emerged unscathed, a serpent shedding its skin. This act of treachery would become the defining pattern of his reign, to use those around him as tools of convenience and to destroy them the moment they lost their value. Even as these political storms raged, whispers persisted of Ferdinand's deteriorating health. Palace doctors recorded a series of mysterious physical complications, but their reports were buried deep within the royal archives. Modern historians still debate the nature of his illness, whether it was biological, psychological, or both, yet all agree on one point. The torment that haunted Ferdinand's private life soon infected the kingdom itself. Whatever the medical diagnosis, the reality within the palace grew more unsettling by the day. Ferdinand's condition demanded constant intervention, elaborate adjustments, elaborate secrecy, and above all, absolute obedience from those around him. His search for a new bride became deeply pragmatic. He no longer sought companionship or alliance, but control. He chose women he believed could be shaped to his will, ensuring that the royal household remained a place of silence rather than sympathy. By now, the royal workshops had transformed into something far removed from art or craftsmanship. Hidden deep within the palace, these rooms produced strange and secretive devices, said to aid the king's medical requirements. Whether these instruments were truly medicinal or simply mechanisms of obsession remains a question lost to time. The men who labored there worked under an oath of absolute secrecy, and according to rumor, those who spoke out met grim and mysterious ends. In 1808, Ferdinand's carefully constructed world collapsed. Napoleon's armies crossed the Pyrenees, and the Spanish monarchy imploded. The self-proclaimed desired one was forced to abdicate and taken to France as a royal prisoner. Behind the grandeur of titles and uniforms, his greatest fear now lay exposed: that his conquerors had discovered the one secret he had tried all his life to conceal. Ferdinand's 6-year confinement at the Château de Valençay in France became a chapter of relentless medical observation. French physicians, freed from the fear that had silenced their Spanish counterparts, examined the fallen monarch with cold, clinical detachment. Their notes, later discovered in Napoleonic archives, describe a ruler whose mysterious physical ailment defied all conventional understanding. What they uncovered was not merely a condition of the body, but a symbol of a dynasty collapsing under the weight of its own corrupted lineage. The doctors concluded that Ferdinand's suffering stemmed from generations of inbreeding and hereditary decay, a perfect storm of inherited flaws. To them, he was not just a patient, but the embodiment of royal degeneration, an experiment in how power and isolation could deform both flesh and spirit. Meanwhile, news from Spain filtered through the walls of his captivity. Brave soldiers and citizens were dying in mountain passes and muddy fields to restore a king who had long since ceased to care for them. The irony was unbearable. While his nation bled for freedom, Ferdinand spent his exile drafting endless letters to Europe's royal courts, seeking alliances, titles, and above all, another marriage that might redeem his cursed legacy. Each letter revealed the same haunting truth: the man Spain fought to restore was already lost to obsession, fear, and vanity. When Ferdinand VII finally returned to Spain in 1814, the nation erupted in euphoria.
Flowers rained from balconies, crowds wept in the streets, and children glimpsed the man whose name had become legend. For a moment, Madrid seemed to breathe hope again, believing the dark years were over, but the king's thoughts were elsewhere. His first obsession as a restored monarch was not governance but legacy. He was consumed by the need to secure an heir and erase the personal failures that haunted his exile. This return marked the beginning of what historians later called the ominous decade. Yet the true darkness lay not in politics alone, but in the private chambers of the royal palace. The king's long-standing health afflictions had become entangled with his governing style, fusing personal turmoil with political tyranny. The instability of the monarch soon became the instability of the nation itself. One of Ferdinand's earliest decrees as king was peculiar. He ordered the creation of a new collection of medical instruments, custom-made by Europe's most skilled artisans. Couriers were sent to Germany, Italy, and even the Ottoman Empire, seeking masters capable of designing what official records called devices for delicate royal circumstances. The resulting contraptions, locked away in hidden chambers of the palace, symbolized not progress but desperation, a ruler's futile attempt to master both his body and his destiny. His chosen bride, Maria Isabel of Portugal, entered this world of secrecy and superstition in 1816. Barely 19, she carried the bright expectations of youth into a court suffocating under paranoia and silence. No amount of royal preparation could have steeled her for what awaited. A union shadowed by fear, ritual, and the ghosts of a dynasty already crumbling from within.
The wedding was a Baroque spectacle, a masterpiece of light, gold, and illusion, crafted to disguise the king's deepening despair. At the altar, Ferdinand's expression betrayed the weight of his anxieties. For weeks he had surrounded himself with a strange procession of physicians, mystics, and self-proclaimed miracle workers, one of whom was rumored to have traveled from the east under the cloak of secrecy. But the splendor of the ceremony could not conceal what came after. Behind the palace walls, the royal union disintegrated into chaos. Despite every preparation and every promise from his assembled experts, the king's frailty and obsessions proved overwhelming. That first night left scars that neither he nor his young bride would ever recover from. In the weeks that followed, Queen Maria Isabel's demeanor changed drastically. Her once bright voice faltered. She spoke in fragments, her laughter replaced by silence. Witnesses described how she would flinch at the mere sound of footsteps approaching her chambers, as though expecting some unseen terror. Palace physicians spoke cautiously of nervous disturbances, but those closest to her understood. The young queen had entered a private hell from which there would be no return. Ferdinand, stripped of empathy, saw his wife's fear not as a cry for help, but as a direct challenge to his authority. His paranoia, already legendary in the palace corridors, grew into something darker. He became convinced that Queen Maria Isabel was secretly collaborating with foreign envoys to undermine him. He ordered her letters intercepted, her food inspected, and her chambers searched for evidence that did not exist. The king's private insecurities had now metastasized into full-blown political madness. Every gesture, every whisper was reinterpreted as treason. His desperate quest for an heir turned into a royal obsession that consumed the entire court. He convened bizarre medical councils, bringing together physicians, scholars, and self-proclaimed experts who claimed to hold answers to his mysterious affliction. The royal apartments began to resemble a grim theater of superstition and delusion. Witnesses spoke of strange gatherings late at night, endless consultations, whispered arguments, and elaborate rituals that blurred the line between science and madness. Among the hidden records of this era lies the diary of a court physician. It describes a monarch willing to sacrifice his dignity, allowing foreign specialists to observe and advise on his private struggles, all in the name of duty to his crown. These secret meetings became infamous in Europe, whispered about by diplomats as evidence of a kingdom ruled not by reason, but by obsession. Isabel, subjected to relentless intrusion and humiliation, began to show unmistakable signs of psychological collapse. She lost weight rapidly, her voice faltered, and her gaze turned vacant, the look of a woman whose spirit had been hollowed out. Within the palace walls, the young queen became a silent shadow,
haunting the corridors of a royal prison that doubled as her own mind. The political consequences of Ferdinand's private failures could no longer be contained. Across the Atlantic, Spain's colonies, already burning with rebellion, seized upon the king's weakness as a sign of divine abandonment. Revolutionary pamphlets portrayed him as a monarch whose personal decay mirrored the rot of his empire. His deepest insecurities became the symbolic spark for uprisings from Mexico to Argentina. Ferdinand's reaction was both predictable and terrifying. He responded with paranoia and purges, branding all criticism as treason. Whispers about the royal family's condition or the failures of his rule were enough to summon the dreaded investigators of the revived Inquisition. Once more, Spain was plunged into an age of fear, where private conversations could cost lives, and even silence could be mistaken for dissent. The king's obsession with secrecy descended into full madness. He ordered the construction of hidden corridors throughout the palace, allowing him to move unseen between his own quarters and those of the queen. Mirrors were positioned at impossible angles to expose potential spies, and an entire network of servants was repurposed into informants, whose sole task was to report on every whisper within the royal walls. Under the crushing weight of her husband's paranoia and control, Queen Maria Isabel's health collapsed beyond recovery. Her once bright spirit faded to silence, her presence reduced to a faint echo within the halls of power. In 1818, after 2 years of relentless decline, tragedy struck. The Queen passed away under what official documents called nervous exhaustion. But within the palace, many whispered that her death was not purely natural, that it was instead the inevitable end of a life smothered by fear. Her final recorded words, spoken in a trembling whisper, were simply, "Thank God, it's over." Ferdinand's reaction stripped away the last illusion of reason. He refused to grieve. Instead, he raged, accusing invisible enemies of conspiracy, demanding repeated examinations of her body, and imprisoning those closest to her for imagined treachery. His mourning became indistinguishable from mania. Witnesses described him pacing through darkened corridors, speaking to the air as though his late wife could still hear him. The palace, once the seat of a mighty empire, had become a mausoleum echoing with the voice of a mad king. Grief did not delay the royal obsession with producing an heir. Within months of the Queen's death, Ferdinand's advisors began searching for a third bride, a task nearly impossible. Across Europe, royal courts whispered of the Spanish king's cursed marriages, and most candidates quietly withdrew. At last, an arrangement was secured with Maria Josepha of Saxony, whose family's dwindling fortune made them unusually receptive to the match. She arrived in Madrid in 1819, pragmatic and unromantic, viewing her royal duty less as a matter of passion and more as an obligation to be carefully managed. Their marriage quickly assumed a chilling rhythm of formality and distance. Interactions between the king and queen were precisely scheduled, monitored by attendants, and carried out with mechanical detachment. Maria Josepha treated her role with a strange professionalism, methodical, emotionless, and observant. Ferdinand, consumed by paranoia, became convinced that she was quietly documenting his every behavior for foreign courts, turning his private struggles into diplomatic gossip. Beyond the palace walls, Spain itself was disintegrating. The empire that once spanned continents was bleeding out, its colonies in the Americas declaring independence one after another. While nations were being born from the ashes of Spain's rule, Ferdinand remained trapped in his own obsession, holding endless consultations and delaying matters of state. Europe began to mock what Spain had become, a fading kingdom ruled by a man at war with his own shadow. Against all odds, in 1829, after a decade of sterile matrimony, Queen Maria Josepha conceived. The news stunned Europe. For the first time in his reign, Ferdinand tasted something close to hope. He surrounded his wife with guards, doctors, and even mystics, terrified that fate would once again betray him. But in the 7th month, tragedy struck. Maria Josepha delivered prematurely, and the fragile infant survived only a few hours. The Queen herself lingered for weeks before finally succumbing to illness. Her passing extinguished the last fragile light in the king's world. Ferdinand's descent into madness was now complete. He locked himself away in the palace, refusing to face reality. Servants whispered of a monarch wandering through candlelit halls, clutching portraits of the dead, speaking to them as if they still breathed. The King of Spain had become a ghost haunting his own throne. Desperate to salvage the dynasty, his ministers arranged a final marriage to Maria Cristina of Naples. The union, forged in secrecy and desperation, was less about affection and more about preserving the illusion of succession. In his final years, Ferdinand's paranoia took on monstrous new forms. He had hidden peepholes cut between chambers to spy on the Queen's movements. Guards patrolled at all hours. Every meal was tasted in front of him, and every servant lived in fear of a sudden accusation. The palace that once symbolized royal majesty had transformed into a fortress of madness, its ruler consumed, not by ambition, but by terror.
Maria Cristina became a psychological captive, trapped behind the polished mirrors and locked doors of a decaying palace. Outside, Spain was disintegrating. The colonies lost, the treasury emptied, and the monarchy surviving only through a fragile illusion of legitimacy. By 1833, Ferdinand's body had finally surrendered to the same decay that had long consumed his mind. He died, not of any single ailment, but of complete physical and spiritual collapse, a man undone by the very obsessions that once defined his power. What followed his death was shrouded in secrecy. The royal physicians conducted their final examinations in silence, sealing their notes under royal decree. Those few who glimpsed the report spoke only in whispers of an anatomy so deformed it seemed like a curse, and of the lifelong torment it inflicted upon him. The records vanished soon after, rumored to have been hidden deep within forbidden archives, never again to see daylight. Ferdinand VII's true legacy is not that of a monarch, but of a tragic warning. He proved that when power is joined with shame, and fear replaces reason, an empire can collapse under the weight of one man's secret despair. Spain's decline did not begin on the battlefield, but in the shadowed corridors of a palace ruled by madness. Empires do not fall overnight. They decay from within, through fear, pride, and silence. Ferdinand VII's story is more than the fall of a king. It's a mirror held up to every generation that allows power to go unchallenged and truth to be buried. If history teaches us anything, it's that darkness always begins with denial, and it only ends when someone dares to look. So if you believe forgotten stories like this deserve to be told, if you want to see more of the world's hidden past brought to light, subscribe to Dark Page of History. Join us in uncovering the truths the world tried to erase, one shadowed story at a time.